Now, I like Boris Johnson, and I know many of you that watch these videos also like Boris Johnson. However, I am critical. Benjamin Franklin said the first responsibility of every citizen is to question authority, and that's why I feel we have to be very, very critical of what Boris Johnson's doing. That being said, I still like Boris Johnson. He's very charming, he's very charismatic. I think he's a good leader. I think he's a breath of fresh air within the Conservative Party. A lot of people don't really get what Boris Johnson is about. When I talk to a lot of maybe like the poorer segment of society, the more downtrodden, the working class, they think Boris Johnson's the saviour. A lot of these people, especially within the white working class community, worry about immigration. They worry about the schools their children are going to that are being overcrowded. They worry about the NHS services they may need to access. They worry about their pensions in the future. They think Boris Johnson's kind of this nationalistic hero who's just going to shut the borders, build a wall, Donald Trump style. I mean, this is so far away from the truth. We've done previous videos on this. Boris Johnson is pro illegal immigrant amnesty. He's talked about this for years. He's talked about this for something like 12 years now. Go back and watch the video we did it on previously. Since he was the editor of The Spectator, something like 10, 12 years ago, he's talked about this amnesty for 500,000 illegal immigrants. It's something he talked about when he was London mayor. He's pro-immigrant, he's pro-immigration. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I've said that in the previous videos. I don't really have a problem with these things, but it's kind of interesting. He's this magician, right? He takes ideas that like the working class want, the middle class want, and then obviously the elites who pretty much always get what they want anyway. And he's a magician. He adapts. He's a chameleon. He's all things to all people at the same time. He's a genius. He's a political genius. A lot of the liberals maybe there's the elements that don't support him think he's this very hard right leader. The Tories have brought in this Donald Trump because he's got the same haircut. He's very, very different to Donald Trump. I mean, both are kind of media geniuses. Both of them are good at manipulating the media. Boris Johnson really puts on this bumbling buffoon act. It's not true. He's a very, very intelligent man. But Donald Trump and Boris Johnson do it in different ways. Trump's more, he manipulates the media in a very interesting, deep way by his tweets and social media posts. That's not something that Boris Johnson does. There are a lot of more right-wing people that want like a rebellious Tory leader. Boris Johnson isn't really that person. He's very, very pro-establishment Tory. He's probably one of the most pro-establishment Tories prime ministers we've had in a long time. Boris Johnson was really a pressure relief valve. There was a real hatred of the Conservative Party building in the UK with their mishandling of Brexit. We had David Cameron and Theresa May. Nothing was really happening, extension after extension. There was this real pressure building. Potentially, if we didn't leave in the 31st of October, the Tory parties were going to burn. Now, we brought the magician in. He said all the right things up until the 31st of October. Now, most people tend to agree that there was nothing Boris Johnson could have done. We had this tyrannical Remainer Parliament. I disagree. I think there were constitutional avenues Boris Johnson could have pursued to force a Brexit on the 31st of October. My personal opinion, WTO, hard clean break Brexit, is something that Boris Johnson has never wanted. He didn't pursue that. They portrayed in the media he had this ace up his sleeve. How was he going to get us out on the 31st of October? They had no real plan. The plan was they were just going to photocopy the document, so it's on cheap, low-quality photocopy paper, not sign it, and send it to the EU. That's not really a great plan. I think most prime ministers would have fallen if they had tried that stunt. But Boris Johnson is a genius. It worked for him as a calculated risk, and the voters, the media, loved it. We know pressure is growing to extend the Brexit transitional period. It's not something that I want. I'm pretty consistent on my views on Brexit. I've been making videos on this cause now for 2.5 years, maybe longer than that. Go back in my history. I'm pretty consistent on what I want on Brexit. I'm pretty clean, hard break Brexit, free trade agreement. Great. It's not something that I think the EU particularly want us to have. And if they don't want us to have it, if they're not willing to negotiate, then we just have to leave under WTO. Clean break Brexit if they're not willing to negotiate any kind of free trade agreement. We know the pressure is building. This is obvious. The Remainers are always going to seize this. So a few news stories here to build the sentiment of the pressure that's growing in the UK. This one's from BBC News. Coronavirus. Welsh Government calls for longer Brexit transition. A letter from Mark Drakeford to the Prime Minister says not doing so could cause a further economic shock. Another story here from the Belfast Telegraph. Brexit negotiations during pandemic are unwelcome and unnecessary distraction. The Scottish Government has reiterated calls for Prime Minister Boris Johnson to halt the UK government's Brexit negotiations and instead focus on its efforts on tackling coronavirus. This one here from Reuters. Britain's embattled logistics industry calls for Brexit to be delayed. Britain's logistic industry is urging the government to delay its departure from the European Union because it cannot prepare for Brexit while battling to get food and medical supplies into the country during the coronavirus pandemic. All these stories being released only in the last few days. This one here from YouGov, how Britons are reacting to coronavirus. And about halfway down the page, we have this poll with how the British public support various measures that the government have been taking, i.e. shutting schools, placing London under lockdown, rationing food. The last one here, clearly extending Brexit transitional period. This YouGov poll, anyway, I mean, we all know polls aren't particularly that accurate. They're not the be-all and end-all. However, there is a shift now. 55% of people in this poll say the right decision now is to extend the Brexit transitional period. So we knew this was going to happen. We knew this was going to be a big fight, and we knew the black swan that coronavirus is going to be a problem. Now, the economic issues are silly. The Scottish government, the Welsh government saying this really isn't the time because of economic reasons. It doesn't matter. GDP is dropping 5, 10, 15% this year anyway. It would be immeasurable. The difference between a WTO hard Brexit now, you wouldn't even be able to measure the difference. Economists would struggle to find that 0.1% difference that it makes because the economy's gone off a cliff now. This is actually a very, very good time just to push through a WTO Brexit because the economy's smashed into a wall anyway. There's dead bodies everywhere anyway. Well, both literally from coronavirus and just the mess that the economy now is in and is going to be in over the next 2-3 quarters, probably years going on that. I think WTO is the way to go. I'm definitely not repositioning my stance on that. I think that's the only Brexit we're really going to get from the European Union at this point. I mean, Boris Johnson really is a wild card. He's very much like a kind of, it's probably wrong to say a populist leader, but he's a leader that will tend to go with what's popular and what will advance the aims of the Tory party long term. So now the public opinion has shifted. Obviously, the majority of that 55% are people that originally voted Remain or were Remainers, but there seems to be a shift from people that have supported Leave over to the extension of the Brexit transitional period. Now, if Boris Johnson feels there's enough people and he's going to win enough support and can potentially still be re-elected in 4 years' time, I think there's a chance that he personally will think about extending the Brexit transitional period. Because I don't think a WTO is something he's ever wanted, and that's the position now that the EU know they have leverage now. Not only, I think the EU know Boris Johnson never wanted a WTO. They know the Welsh government are putting pressure on Parliament now, or at least Boris Johnson. The Scottish government are putting pressure on. We start to have industries putting pressure on Boris Johnson. So he's boxed into a little bit of a corner. The more interesting wild card, if anything, is Dominic Cummings. Now, Dominic Cummings is very ideologically driven. He's the big Eurosceptic, right? That's pulling the strings over Boris Johnson. Again, he's a bit of a wild card because the post-coronavirus world is very different from the pre-coronavirus world. This is really like a September the 11th moment. Those, if you're old enough to remember, have lived through September the 11th, which I was as a teenager when that happened. The world is a very different place. I mean, that was a quick shock within the space of an hour. Once the second plane hit the World Trade Center, people knew the world had changed forever. The world had become massively more unstable. And that one shock has changed, geopolitics and the world and politics in general up until this point, and probably will do for the next 100 years, if not more. That was a real day that shook the world. Coronavirus has done the same. The globalization, the kind of this just-in-time delivery, outsourcing everything to China, not worrying about supporting farmers, not worrying about supporting the fishing industry. Coronavirus has changed this. People now think shocks like this can really bring a country to its knees. I think it really makes sense that, the farming industry and fishing industry are of national security. So someone can argue, right, we can get these potatoes cheaper from this faraway country or whatever it is. Okay, but in a devastating shock, you could starve to death, right? And we're an island, so it makes sense that if we can produce as much on this island as we can ourselves and not have to rely on, stuff being flown in, ships coming in. The world's changed a lot. Countries around Europe are throwing up the borders. Countries around Europe are becoming increasingly nationalistic. We have the French seizing face masks. We have various different countries seizing medical supplies that were due to be exported because the world is now a very different place. Now, this is probably a temporary thing that will blow over. But essentially, we are all Brexiteers now. Every country in the world has essentially adopted the philosophy, the sentiment that drove Brexit forward. Governments are now protecting their own people rather than the larger corporate globalist agenda. Now, I'm sure the multinational corporations will come off very well off the back of coronavirus, and it makes sense. So many small, medium, self-employed, businesses and self-employed people are going to go bankrupt, are going to fold through the coronavirus epidemic, that this leaves a lot of pie for the big multinationals. Multinational companies will always do well. But the world has changed. The world has changed, and we're all Brexiteers now. Every country is becoming increasingly, we need to do this to look after our own people. We need to have sovereignty. We need to have our own borders. You just look at what's happening to EU nations over that. So it's a really interesting one, just what's happening in the world now. I mean, let me know your thoughts and opinions. Do you think Boris Johnson will potentially fold to pressure from at least these polls from YouGov that show 55% of people now want a Brexit extension? Will he listen to the pressure coming from the Scottish and Welsh governments? Or do you think he's going to push this through, a WTO hard Brexit on the 31st of December? I mean, we're definitely going to find out in the next sort of 12 weeks or so as we get to the end of June, where the extension will have to be asked for. Since this coronavirus thing started happening and it become really obvious about the pressure and the problems that Boris Johnson will be in, and, Barnier is now down with coronavirus, David Frost is now down with coronavirus. Without those two key negotiators, nothing's really going to dry. I mean, Barnier could be ill with coronavirus until the end of June, past the deadline to ask for a transitional period extension anyway. He could be ill till like July, August. We don't know. He's an old guy, right? He might even die. We don't know. And then everything, that's the cat amongst the pigeons. Like, it's just going to be chaos. So I think it's very slim chance the EU will seriously negotiate a free trade agreement. It was going to be very tight on time before anyway. It was always going to be tight on time. Now we have this black swan event, which really is a spanner in the works. So I just truly don't believe Boris Johnson will push a WTO hard Brexit. I mean, I really hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong on that. But my feeling is, just a gut feeling, is they'll ask for an extension. How long that extension will be, who knows? I think 6 months is pointless. 6 months will just be squandered in no time. Coronavirus will still be here in 6 months, at least the effects of it. It'll still be here probably in a year's time. We're probably quite looking at, if immunisation doesn't come very soon, we're looking at a second wave, as we go into flu season next year, next autumn. We're probably looking at a second wave, potentially more lockdowns. Sensibly, if you want an extension, it should be a 2-year one. I mean, it pains me to say it. I'd much rather they pull the trigger, bite the bullet, and WTO on the 31st of December. I mean, it's a difficult one, guys. There's plenty of YouTube channels you can watch out there that flag waving Boris Johnson supporting YouTubers. And if you just want that analysis, go and watch them. But unfortunately, my general opinion is it's not going good, and Boris Johnson is a flippy floppy fish. Dominic Cummings is very hardline. He's like an arrow. He has the things that he wants, and he tries his best to attain them. But I think Dominic Cummings is a very smart guy. He's probably looking at this thinking, well, the world's changed. This is a 9/11 event. This is a game changer. It's a paradigm shift. Every country in the world now is adopting Brexit sentiment. So maybe we can seize upon that. And if you're an intelligent person like Dominic Cummings clearly is, he can probably work a strategy out to maybe even make the UK greater through this current situation than just Brexit alone. I don't know, it's an interesting one. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions on this one. I'm expecting a lot of downvotes anyway, because if I say anything critical about Boris Johnson, the flag wave, I mean, I like the guy. I still like the guy. I'll just leave it at that. I'll see you in the next video anyway.